Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is my Friday reads, 4 books completed. James Clammer, Insignificance. A collection of short stories by William H. Gass called In the Heart of the Country. And 2 books by Leonardo Sciascia, an Italian, I suppose you'd call him a detective thriller writer, but with a difference that I'll come on to. Anyway, Equal Danger, which is a 115-page novel, and 2 novellas, The Night and Death, which was 55 pages long, and One Way or Another, which was 100 pages exactly. And the translators are so for The Night and Death was translated by Joseph Farrell, and One Way or Another was translated by Sasha Rabinovich, and for Equal Danger this was translated by Adriana Fulca, who also translated The Council of Sicily, the Council of Egypt, which I reviewed last week. Okay, well let's start with The Clamor. I think this is his debut novel, though he has been published as a short story writer. And it's one of those books that is really 2 different books struggling to come out of, you know, they've been brought together in one and it doesn't work. They should, in a way, have their own separate books. And I think the book suffers for that. So the first third of the book is Joe Forbes is a plumber who has been off work for some years due to having suffered a nervous breakdown. And the book opens with his first day back after his wife has got him a job working for a good friend of hers. And the reason he had his nervous breakdown is because he and his wife have a son who suffers from what's called Capgras syndrome, which is where you believe to your very, very core that someone has been replaced by an exact copy. And that's usually associated with some forms of Alzheimer's. It's very unusual to be in a young person, but it's a very interesting concept and may be one of the factors behind the whole sort of changeling trope of stories through the ages. But anyway, and the son, Edward, believes that his mother is not really his mother, but a copy of her, that she has been snatched away and replaced by this woman. And to such an extent that he tries to poison her and is sent away to prison for it. And Joe sort of holds it all together with his son being in prison, his wife being in hospital. But when his wife comes out sort of fully recovered, that's when sort of Joe collapses and has his nervous breakdown. So all that happens before the book starts. And the first third, as I say, is Amanda, the friend, sort of goes off, leaves him to work in her airing cupboard on the sort of hot water immersion system or whatever it is. And it is told very much in detail of, you know, screws and nuts and lug wrenches and all this sort of stuff. You know, it is, on the one hand, quite an interesting representation of a working class profession. But on the other hand, it's a literary one. Inevitably, it's a literary one. You know, there are some metaphors and things, which sort of undermines that sort of purity of the experience. And, you know, increasingly things are going wrong for him on this job. One of his sort of things he's developed is his skin is very brittle and it cuts easily. And he keeps having to, you know, his wife had made him wear gloves, but there are certain jobs that you know, sort of unscrewing things you can't do in gloves. You know, you need the grip. So he sort of ends up cutting himself and then having to put plasters on and bleeding on the floor and all this sort of stuff. So it's become quite trying. And then the doorbell goes and he goes downstairs to answer it, and it's his son who's been out of prison, but it's now actually his parole has finished, so he's totally sort of at liberty. And, you know, there's the question of, well, how did he know he was here? This is his first day back working. And because he and his wife have an exclusion zone around their house in law, the son couldn't have got the information from his wife. It is resolved, and that's fine. And I'm not picking it up as a flaw. But then, you know, all that stuff about plumbing is never referred to again, because then the rest of the book is the father and the son driving in the car, having a walk, having a meal, you know, and there's supposed to be some sort of, you know, that Joe is a bit concerned that, oh, he's back in circulation, maybe he's going to try again to kill his wife. So there's a bit of sort of tension there, but it doesn't really go anywhere. And then after he sort of sent his son packing with some money, basically buying him off, he then goes on a bender, you know, drinking and you know, sort of basically he hasn't had sex in years with his nervous breakdown. He's sort of ogling women, I would like to in his mind, but nothing happens. So that's it, that's the book. And as I say, those to me, you know, is it a book about a son with Carpass syndrome who tried to kill your wife, which is interesting, or is it a study of a working class profession of plumbing, which is also interesting, but the two together did not work for me. But that wasn't my problem with the book. We have a very strange narrator here who refers to the man Joe, the woman Amanda, who knowingly sort of says, I, the narrator, realise that we haven't talked much about, you know, the scenery that Joe was walking through, but then there's plenty of nature writing, so I don't feel the need to contribute to any more, which is a gag, but that sort of level of sort of interruption, or, you know, by the narrator, you know, why, to what purpose? And then the second part associated with that is an inconsistency of, sorry, just going back to that, you know, is it somehow that the narrator represents a Carpass syndrome of its own, that somehow Joe doesn't regard himself as his true being, but has been replaced by this previous broken Joe? Or the broken Joe is what he really is, and the previous happy Joe was somehow the imposter. I don't know what the purpose of this strange distancing advice of the narrator was. And then there's a sort of inconsistency of tone. So this is on page 8 and 9, you know, the opening of the book. He's gone to Amanda's to do this job. The idea of eyeliner and lipstick and whatever other transformative techniques were being pressed into use upstairs by Amanda Margaret was exciting him. They dropped a flutter into the spot where his lower ribs met. The diaphragm, he believed it to be called. Okay, so he's not exactly sure what that piece of anatomy is called. Okay, that's fine. But just before, on page 8, we've had this. Alison, which is his wife, had won that argument, she possessing a combination of infinite patience and steelish resolve, which might in some manifest as attritional bullying or passive aggression. Well, if you don't know what a diaphragm is, would you know the terms attritional bullying and passive aggression? You know, as I say, there was an inconsistency of tone, and that redounded back to describing the plumbing, but making it literary in some places. So, I didn't really find this book worked. I gave it 3 stars. So, William Gass, In the Heart of the Country, collection of short stories, and those regular viewers know I've been really struggling with short stories for 3 or 4 years now. The reason I picked this up is I wanted something I could read in a day, and also William Gass's The Tunnel is one of my maximalist reads for this year, so this will sort of get me in the mood for it. And the first short story is actually 80 pages long. It's quite long. It's called The Kid Pedersen, and it's really, really good. All of these stories are set in the Midwest, and mainly during winter. You know, so it's like freezing cold with snow and everything. That permeates most of the stories here. And this kid, Pedersen, is found sort of outside in a snowdrift. He's the neighbour's kid, but the neighbour in the countryside, so it's quite a way away. And it opens with Big Hands, who is the sort of... He's not really a stepbrother, he's sort of an adoptive brother, older brother, of the narrator, who's a younger child. Big Hands sort of brings him in, and they have to try and revive him, bring him back to life with very, very careful treatment, how they, you know, they initially sort of smear more snow on him and then wrap him in towels, and then they pour whiskey down him, all this sort of stuff. And they revive him. But as they revive him, the kid is delusional and sort of shouts out these things to give the impression that he was being chased by something back in his home. And then the family whose house it is here, they start debating, you know, is there a real threat there? Have his parents been murdered? We need to return this kid to his family, but is the killer still there? Are we going to find bodies in the basement? All this sort of stuff. And then they begin a bit of an epic journey, even though it's only between 2 farmhouses. But it's epic because of the hurdle of the snow and the ice and everything. So it's not even clear that the kid is with them on their trek over to the other house, that maybe they've just gone over there to see what's happening. But the other kid, the younger kid narrator, he becomes marooned in the other farmhouse, and then the story sort of ends with him sort of feeling trapped and needing to escape. So it's they've swapped kids, really. It's a really interesting and a brilliantly written story. And then we had 3 stories I was less taken with. We have Mrs. Mean, which is a bit of a sort of family portrait of a family out in the Midwest, where the mother and her kids, they would never sit still enough for a portrait, because the kids are both wild but also in massive fear of their mother, who treats them mean, which is why she's sort of nicknamed Mrs. Mean. And it's a portrait of the immediate community, of the few houses around hers and stuff. But I couldn't see to what end. It didn't really go anywhere, and of course she and her kids are thoroughly unlikable. And the narrator, sort of observing all this, is a bit sort of feckless and a bit of a slob, so he's not particularly likeable. So I couldn't quite see, other than a portrait of a certain type out in the Midwest, I couldn't really see what that was giving us. Then we had a story called Icicles, which is about an estate agent, or what Americans call a realtor, who's getting lots of sort of pep, homilies and exhortations from his boss as to how to sell stuff. It's a down on its heels agency, because in the winter it's really hard to show stuff in a good light with all the, everything's so cold and miserable. And this realtor, he sort of becomes bewitched by the icicles on his house, on his own house, and sort of wants to protect them as if they were sort of rare flowers. He doesn't want them ever to sort of melt, disappear, break off, that sort of stuff. And he becomes sort of absolutely it's as if his fate is tied up with the fate of the icicles. As long as they're there, his life will progress satisfactorily. But somehow if they cease to be, then that will affect his life in a bad way. So, who really wants to read about realtors? Not me. Then we have a really short story called Order of Insects, where a housewife who's normally, scared of every creepy, crawly and bug, comes to an accommodation with them, and she realises their place in it's not specifically God's universe, but in the universe, and their relation to her, that that she couldn't exist without them. They're all part of this sort of greater hierarchy of life, and there are things above her in the same way as she's above the insects. But this was written or it was published in '58, so I don't know how fresh it was then. It doesn't read very fresh now. But then we come to In the Heart of the Country, which is a brilliant study again of a Midwest community, done in a sort of quite light touch. It's not a complete narrative. It's broken up into different sections, almost like snapshots, descriptions within those snapshots. And I really enjoyed that. So a mixed bag, but I gave it 4 stars because we know Gass is a fabulous writer. And before I get on to the 2 Sciascia books, I'm just going to talk about what I'm currently reading. I'm currently reading Nervous System by Lina Borine. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. A Chilean writer of Palestinian origin. And this is a buddy read with Roxy at A Chaotic Bibliophile. And I'm only one section of the 5 sections into this, but this is fantastic. I said to Roxy in our Voxer message that if this book sustains at the level it started off at, this is in with a shot at being my book of the year. But let's not prejudge it too much and put too much pressure on it. But so far so good. And on to the 2 Sciascia books. So I'd say last week I read and reviewed The Council of Egypt, which was a historical sort of detective fiction book. These are very much set in the 70s, in Sciascia's own time. And I wanted to launch off from them about a discussion about political fiction, because I have always been on the hunt for good British political fiction, and it doesn't exist. I mean, there's bad political fiction, from Doris Lessing's The Good Terrorist, through Alison Miller's Demo, which is about the Not in My Name marches against the wars in the Middle East, but were appalling. What else? Oh yes, 10 Days, a book by the South African writer who's moved to England whose name I can't remember, I'll put it on the title, which was about the 2011 riots in London, and cites the story between the Prime Minister, his ambitious Home Secretary, and the Chief of the Metropolitan Police. And the rioters don't enter into it, hardly at all, which is utterly baffling to cite a grassroots, spontaneous flare-up in response to a man being shot dead by the police, and only concern itself with high politics. I mean, I absolutely hated that book. The one decent, half-decent work of British political fiction that I would recommend is GB84 by David Peace, which covers the miners' strike. And that works because it's written in Peace's trademark style of voices rather than characters, you know, sort of voices in the shadows, and lots of repetition in the speech rhythms and stuff. So his style makes that book work. But it was about a very particular period in British history, and also a period that marked a changing of the class structure within Britain, because in the mid-80s, under Mrs Thatcher's sort of throwing open capitalism to the upper working classes through share ownership, the right to buy your council house and become a house owner, privatising of health, all these sorts of things, she basically bought off the upper echelons of the working classes. And split the working classes into those who were sort of aspirant of middle class status, but were afforded a means to where that actually could be brought about, and the lumpen proletariat, who were people who were basically out of work because of the huge unemployment that her policies caused, people with difficulties, be it mental health or addictions, who had all of their support network pulled away as under the guise of cost savings, and their children were sent to schools that had no ambition to teach them, sort of holding pens to keep them off the streets between the hours of 9 and 5, and which we are still suffering from. You know, when we have our periodic flare-ups, it's the children of those who rioted in the 80s. You know, the recent 2011. Some of the areas were in exactly the same places as the riots in the 80s. So, even Brexit, I've read several sort of post-Brexit British novels, but they don't do the job. So, writing politics in the UK is a forlorn pursuit, and yet here we have an absolute panorama of Italian politics, and 1970s Italy, and I remember all this from news items on the TV. You had obviously the PCI, the Italian Communist Party, who were always trying to get elected through the ballot box, but you also had the inheritors of Mussolini, the MSI, who also fought elections, as well as the more centrist parties. So you had that sort of electoral sort of configuration, but you also had terrorism groups like the Red Brigade, but also on the far right you had operators who blew up the train station at Bologna, and I think 50 people were killed because Bologna was seen as a red town, a socialist town, and it was attacked by the far right. You had things like, the Red Brigade would sort of snatch high political people. They kidnapped an ex-prime minister, and he was found dead in the boot of a car. They would kidnap high bankers and high industrialists. The play Accidental Death of an Anarchist by Dario Fo, very much, and Franca Areva, who was an actress who was Fo's longtime partner, is referred to in one of these books. I see them very much in the same vein. That play and these books are describing the same morass of Italian society. You also had sort of states within states, not only of these paramilitary groups, but the P2 Masonic scandal, where the Vatican banker was found hanging from one of the bridges over the River Thames in London, and investigation to that led to the P2 scandal of all this sort of secret Masonic stuff, which is outlawed in Italian law. You're not allowed to have secret societies, and of course the Catholic Church being so powerful in Italy, and it too has its own sort of state within a state status, and all of that is in these books, because these books are not the Butler did it detective stories. If you want to read them thinking by the end the killer will be revealed, that is, you're not going to find satisfaction, because what he does so brilliantly is there are specific people bumped off in these books, but somehow, even if the killer is found, which they're not, it's not that individual killer, it's not that individual motivation. It's about the labyrinth of Italian society, with all these competing groups, with the power structure as it is, and nobody knows what their right-hand man is doing and who he is representing. And that the Minotaur, at the centre of this labyrinth of Italian politics and power, has to be fed. Each interest group demands its sacrifice to help boost their cause, and the killers are they're not in the wind, they're almost sort of metaphysical, they're almost an inevitable outcrop of the state of Italian society, and that's what these books get across so brilliantly. So in Equal Danger, we have a series of judges and DAs being knocked off. And it looks like it's an individual with a grudge because he went through the system and was found guilty when he was innocent and wants his revenge. But no, it's much bigger than that. In The Night and Death, which is the shorter of these two novellas, there's a sort of almost like a Davos type meeting, but instead of it being international power mongers, it's the important people in Italy. They're having a dinner. These two guys at different ends of the table are sort of playing a game as to who can seduce this rather elegant, sort of wealthy woman who is sat next to one of them, and they're writing messages back and forwards on their place cards. And one of these two guys ends up dead, and in his pocket is a message written by the other one on his name holder card. So they assume that the other guy is probably going to be guilty. All they need to do is to find his name card that the message has been written on, but they can't find it. And, the investigation goes on, and, it's not about these two uber powerful men who can buy and sell anybody and anything. It's not about their stupid little power game. That is not the cause of this guy's death. The cause of this guy's death is power itself. And the other story, one way or another, is a fascinating tale of an artist, a painter who's sort of driving in the Italian countryside, happens upon this former hermitage that's been converted into a hotel, but is still run by sort of priests. And he goes in and discovers that, again, there's going to be like a sort of a Davos-type meeting for the great and the good of Italy, including ministers, industrialists, bankers, all this sort of stuff. But they're going there as a sort of spiritual retreat, and the painter sort of manages to finagle his way to sort of to join in, that he's going to do the spiritual exercises with him. And the first thing he discovers is that there's 5 prostitutes have been hired for 5 of the guests. So this is a very strange concept of spiritual exercise. But every day they end the sessions with a sort of formation march reciting the rosary, and it's a bit like there's sort of dancing troupes where they're marching, but they're all changing position as they come to the end of the space and they turn around. And the guy who converted it from a hermitage to a hotel, as I say, he's a priest, and his theology is really interesting. It starts on the basis of you can't have virtue without sin, because otherwise virtue would be a gimme. There'd be no way you couldn't be virtuous, because there's no such thing as sin. Therefore, he allows these guys to have the prostitutes, but then there's a sort of coming back from that, back towards virtue and stuff. Anyway, so one of the guys dies while they do this formation rosary, and the police are brought in and stuff, and the painter's still there. And again, it's this sort of labyrinth, this sort of chain of connection, causal connection, but you can't see exactly what the connections are. So again, the killer is power itself and corruption itself, rather than the actual individual who pulled the trigger. These are brilliant, and you know, they're not about the detective story. They are about an absolute eye-opener onto Italian society of the time, the nature of power and the nature of corruption, which, as I say, I'd been exposed to, hadn't thought much about it, but these books brought it all back to me instantly, and I'm very grateful to them. And I've ordered 3 more by this guy. I'm going to read everything that this guy wrote in fiction. The only one I have not ordered is his book of short stories, because, as I say, I'm not particularly on short. But if those 3 books convince me that I need to be a completist, I will order his short story collection. Okay, so there you have it. Oh, both 5 stars, sorry. So that was my week in reading. James Clammer, Insignificance, 3 stars. William Gass, In the Heart of the Country, 4 stars. And the 2 books by Leonardo Sciascia, Equal Danger, and 2 novellas, The Night and Death and One Way or Another, both 5 stars. Daniel at Guilty Feet, you're a prodigious reader of detection fiction. I wonder if you've come across this guy, and if so, what do you make of him? Okay, thanks very much, BookTube. Till next time.